Welcome, everybody. I'm Dr. Siobhan Scary in the English department, and on behalf of myself and Dr. Christine Kraus-Dick from the Communication Arts department, we welcome you to Allie Weaver's senior seminar presentation. Christine and I have been so privileged to work with Allie over the past year on this important project, and we're very excited for her to share her research with you. And here's the way it's going to go. Allie's going to talk for about 35 minutes, and then students from the Communication Arts department and the English department, especially those who are rising seniors, will chime in with a question or two, and then some of the faculty will get in there with some questions too. It's a friendly banter of ideas and nudges for where the project could go, if she was going to write a book or expand the project, and so we're excited to see what she'll do with those questions. So, Allie Weaver, it's all you.
First things first, I printed out 2 extra copies in case you were somebody who didn't get my paper. They're there. I like to follow along when I'm doing presentations, so they're there. I kind of needed something to do before this to walk around and find out. So, yeah, as Siobhan said, I'm Allie Weaver. I'm an English and Communications scholar here at Bethel. Thank you for joining me today as I present my senior seminar project, The System Will Survive, Infantilization as a Method of Controlling Women with Girl-Defined Ministries and The Handmaid's Tale. It's a mouthful, I know. Before we dig in, there's a bunch of people here that I really need to thank. I'm going to get a little gushy here because how often do you get to thank the people that matter most to you in a public setting? So first and foremost, my deepest thanks to my advisors, Christine and Siobhan. Thank you for trusting me and pushing me and lending your brains to this project, and most of all for modeling what it's like to be amazing, brilliant, out of real people. So thank you very much. Thanks to my friends on campus and off who have been amazing listeners and asked me all the right questions to kind of hone this thing into perfection. I don't think anyone from the library is here, but thanks to the library staff for helping me and for letting me check out the materials way too long. And lastly, I want to thank my family for endless advice on this and a million other things. I think I brought this research project up at every family gathering since September and talked a long time about it, so thank you for listening then and now. Okay, let's dig in. So here's a brief overview of what I'm going to be going over today. I'll do a little introduction to my topic and kind of talk about how I landed there. I'll talk about the literature and theory that's guided this project, the methodological framework that I built this project upon. I'll talk about my findings and do a little analysis in action so you guys can see how it worked for me behind the scenes. I'll talk a little bit about what I think I could have done differently in this project, and then we'll do the conclusion and closing matter. So first, how did I get here? I applied for a summer Eureka grant last summer, so 2022, and when I got it, I didn't really know what I wanted to study. I had some kind of vague ideas about technology and God and maybe dystopian stories, and so I worked on that all summer and I did a lot of reading, and then we got to the fall and I was like, oh my gosh, I think I've said everything I want to say on this subject, and I still have 9 months left to study, so that's no good. So I kind of scrapped that. I got back to school and I was noodling around. I was thinking about the essentialization of women as mothers and caretakers, and nothing really happened out of that except that I landed on The Handmaid's Tale as one of my primary texts. So if you aren't familiar with The Handmaid's Tale, it was written by Margaret Atwood in 1985. The basic plot follows a woman named Offred, who is a handmaid in a post-American theocratic totalitarian state of Gilead. In Gilead, women are forced to become personal reproductive attendants, or handmaids, for powerful men and their wives, because climate change has made most of the population infertile, so having babies is a really big deal for them. The government uses religion as a way of justifying this, so that was really interesting. So then I kind of had my text for the English portion, and I was still looking for something like a way to connect that to the communications realm of study. And in my copious hours of browsing Instagram while I was doing on this project, I came across this really interesting hashtag. It is #CrunchingMom. I don't know if any of you guys have heard of it, but it's this whole school of mothers that are really concerned about doing things the all-natural way. Oftentimes they homeschool their children. They don't rely on traditional Western medicine. So a lot of things, good and bad things. But what really interested me about this was a lot of these videos had these threads of the essentialization of women. Women should be stay-at-home moms. They should be stay-at-home mothers and wives and nothing else. And there was also a lot of religion that was woven in with that. So I'll show you guys an example of a video that really caught a reel that really caught my eye. You can see she's faking, she's holding a baby, it's all good. She's talking about how she didn't want to do this initially. And I'll read a little bit of her caption. because it really stuck with me because it kind of reminded me of myself. So, when my friends would say, I just want to be a mom when I grow up, I thought it sounded boring. I didn't grow up dreaming of babies and staying home. I wanted to travel, work overseas, do everything I could, be independent. But then God. He completely shifted everything I held of value, uprooted lies I believed, brought me into a loving husband with 5 beautiful children and a home I take care of. God continues to shape my heart's perspective on life. I will never stop sharing the positives of motherhood and marriage because God has shown me just how beautiful what He has designed and created is. So to be clear, there's nothing wrong with like growing up and changing your priorities. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be a stay-at-home wife and mother. That's fine. I believe every woman should have the right to choose what's best for her and her family if she has one. But what makes this interesting to me is when you frame choosing motherhood and staying at home as something God is dictating you to do, and that your previous desires of independence and adventure are lies. That's where this becomes an interesting thing to research for me. So after that, I kind of explored different accounts until I came across Girl Defined, which is a group that I was marginally familiar with. I had some friends that were interested in them when I was growing up. So this is kind of what their board looks like when you go to Instagram. The account and company is run by 2 sisters, Bethany Beal and Kristen Clark, who were born and raised as evangelical Christian fundamentalists in Texas. Their account started with the publishing of their first book, Girl Defined, God's Radical Design for Womanhood, and blew up from there into a multi-platform company with a storefront, multiple book releases, and an annual conference. So you can see here they have totally like this aesthetically pleasing, nice girls next door vibe. They've got flowers and pretty texts, and they generally look pretty put together, really nice, blonde, that kind of thing. But as I was scrolling, I realized that some of these texts were hiding some really hateful ideas behind these flowerful, beautiful veneers. Like this homophobic assertion that culture, like widespread culture, is telling you lies about your sexual orientation and desire versus the truth of what God is telling you. So you can see they've got, like, in the upper right-hand corner, they've got these lies that they're saying society's telling people, and then the bottom left-hand corner, what they see as God's truth. So this kind of thing, and the attitudes and tones that they use when writing their captions, reminded me of a character called Aunt Lydia from The Handmaid's Tale, and she's the older woman who's in charge of breaking the women from their autonomy and individualism and indoctrinating them into Gilead's system of values to be handmaids. So the way Aunt Lydia spoke, which I'll get into a little bit later, seemed to echo Girl Defined exactly, or the opposite way around. And just like that, I knew this would be the perfect thing to marry with my text, The Handmaid's Tale. So to get into my literature and theory, which kind of shaped this project, I obviously couldn't talk about all 30 of the sources that I used in this presentation, so I tried to pick out the things that were the most impactful and the things that I talked about most in this presentation. And as you can see, they broke down into about 4 different categories of study. And they all kind of informed both of my texts in different ways. So first, you can't talk about surveillance, power, and control without talking about Michel Foucault. He's a French philosopher who created panopticism theory in response to the panopticon prison designed by Jeremy Bentham. And that's what's in that little image down there. If you aren't familiar, this is a cylindrical prison. The guard is stationed in the middle in that little tube thing, and he's hidden by blinds and can see inside every individual cell. However, because he's hidden, the prisoners can't tell that they're being watched. And so they're under this idea of like, oh my gosh, I could be being watched right now, I could not be being watched right now. Anyways, they start self-regulating their behavior because they think they can be watched all the time. So in response to this, Foucault created panopticism theory, which is his interpretation of the prison and the impacts that it has on the prisoners. He says that they will eventually become their own method of suppression because the panopticon has induced in the inmate a state of consciousness and permanent visibility that assures an automatic functioning of power. He writes that panopticism can be applied to any area, not just a prison, anywhere where people feel power exerted over them via this kind of ambiguous constant surveillance, and change their behavior to act in accordance with that authority and surveillance is an example of panopticism. Many sources have already connected panopticism to the Handmaid's Tale because the theocratic government of Gilead has extreme measures of surveillance which impacts the handmaid's self-regulation, which I'll talk about more later. As for language, the most important concept that I came across was logicide, and that's advanced by Christopher Hedges in the book American Fascism. He advances this idea that language when language is corrupted in a totalitarian takeover, old definitions of words are subtly replaced with new meanings. As a result, you have these democratic concepts and ideas that are corrupted and twisted to fit into the new regime's ideas. I had more sources, but for the sake of time, I had to omit them. Most of the sources emphasize that language is critically important to democracy, and that's why groups that are trying to circumvent democracy often rely on the restriction or diminish effectiveness of language. These concepts shed light on speech patterns and well-defined in Handmaid's Tale, which I'll get to in my now. As for feminism, the most important theory that I drew from was Denise Tandiotti's Bargaining with Patriarchy, is the paper that theory was kind of published in. She examines family structures of classic patriarchy. In her paper, these are multi-generational homes which enforce a hierarchy where the oldest and youngest males dominate the oldest and youngest females, respectively. She argues that older women work to uphold these structures, even though these systems rely on their own subjugation. They do this in order to finally reap the power that they've been promised their whole lives. By cooperating with this, they'll get some measure of respect that they didn't have when they were younger, by being submissive to men and providing male children for the family. She furthers this thinking behind the pressure placed on younger women to conform when she says, many women may continue to use all the pressure they can muster to make men live up to their expectations by respecting and valuing them, and will not, except under the most extreme pressure, compromise the basis for their claims by stepping out of line and thus losing their status as respectable women. This can be linked to why the women of Girl Defined are working to uphold these and perpetuate these patriarchal systems of religion that rely on their subjugation. Lastly, a good deal of research has been done on evangelical Christian fundamentalists, which is what Girl Defined Ministries is working to advance in the United States. So first off, what is a fundamentalist? Fundamentalists are a subset of evangelicals, and they work to interpret the Bible extremely literally and apply it to their lives as best as they can, according to the National Association of Evangelicals. One pair of scholars, Sage Mickelson and Sarah Cornfield, wrote a paper called Girls Gone Fundamentalist, Feminine Appeals of White Christian Nationalism, in which they did an analysis of girl-defined materials across the board, so like their YouTube videos, their books, their blogs, and found evidence of white Christian nationalism present in the ministry's teaching today. They assert that Girl Defined capitalizes on recent rises of women's self-help rhetoric to appear empowering to young women. However, they are using this facade to frame white beauty, white femininity, and respective behaviors like submissiveness, modesty, as the ideal way to relate to God. These are, of course, antiquated ideas that have deep roots in white Christian nationalism, but are presented as a radical, empowering thing and something that the rest of the world is against. This idea of evangelical Christian fundamentalist martyrdom is also reflected in Sarah Maasmer's work, Virgin Nation, Sexual Purity in American Adolescence. She identifies this concept of evangelical martyrdom, where typically white Christian evangelicals frame themselves as being under extreme scrutiny and as martyrs for their movement. However, the values they're holding and trying to advance, things like female submissiveness, male dominance, heterosexual marriage, abstinence before marriage, all these things that they see themselves being under scrutiny for are ones that have been the total accepted ideal for thousands of years in a lot of different places around the world. So both of these articles help me understand how Girl Defined's message appears updated, but is really just advancing these old ideas. So to talk a little bit more about my research justifications and the methodological framework that this is built on, I talked a little bit about why I picked Girl Defined. I also picked them because they have a really high follower count, and so they are influencing a lot of different people, which means that they're what we need to be looking at. They have vastly popular materials, they have 6 books and an annual conference, as I mentioned. The time period of data collection that I did, I went back and looked at their posts from May and June of 2020, and I looked only at their static posts, not their reels. And I picked this time frame because this was when American political attention was really closely focused on the intersection of Christianity and politics after the leak and overturning of Roe v. Wade. So I looked at 30 total still posts. I would have liked to do a lot more, but time presented a constraint because this project is only a year long. As for The Handmaid's Tale, it's been a really current piece of media, especially after the Hulu adaptation into a series, and it has also become a symbol of resistance and power against misogyny in politics, especially under the influence of Christianity. So it seemed like a really fitting thing for what I wanted to study. My methodological framework for this project was social criticism. Social criticism works to understand how identities and their subsequent proper desires, fears, values, and relationships function in society, and how those identities are reinforced through language and symbols. I chose this because social criticism focuses on how we perform what we identify as. According to a book, Communication Criticism, Rhetoric, Social Codes, and Cultural Studies by Malcolm Sillars and Bruce Cronbeck, It looks at the ways we're told to behave, how we're positioned by powerful institutions, and the judgments about how well we act out those identities in our interactions with others. It also focuses on monopolies of knowledge, the widespread truths in our society that we affirm via our identities. Part of this is looking at who benefits from the reinforcement of certain identities and values, for example, by keeping marginalized groups down. Other well-off groups benefit. The text asserts that those who position themselves in a place of informational superiority in regards to those widespread truths, like Bethany and Christina Girlfind do, seek advantage by assuming a parental frame of mind and mode of talk in front of their audience, with the goal to persuade them and thus preserve their own way of life, one which operates on traditional gender roles, the centering of the nuclear family, and a culturally, racially, religiously, and sexually homogenous nation. They also reap personal benefits like material and financial resources, which leads them to a higher social status. So, all of that to lead to my analysis. Here we go. The coding of my text and the subsequent analysis of those codes revealed 4 loose kind of groupings of ways that women are infantilized and thus controlled. I found that women are controlled by restricting the language they use and the verbal communication between them and other people, by being forced to wear childish clothing and by seeing childish body language around them, by living in communities of control and surveillance, and of course when they have no freedoms towards their sexual and reproductive autonomy. So first things first, social control via limiting, redefining, and simplifying verbal and written communication. I'm going to talk about Handmaid's Tale first. In the world of Gilead, words and texts are censored heavily. The only reading material to survive the war that brought Gilead into being are copies of the Bible, and those copies are only in the hands of high-powered men. Even things like everyday words and signage are restricted, just to give you a picture of how extreme this is. Communication between people has also been restricted, with everyday greetings like hello and how are you being replaced with meaningless religious phrases. Lastly, women are treated as children by being spoken to as children. So first, the handmaids are set aside from the other female servants of the home, the ones that do the cooking and cleaning. For example, offered notes that she longs to be talked to like an adult, like the other women do with each other, mentions that the other servants talk about her like she can't hear, and that she is like a child. There are some things she must not be told. By setting up these boundaries of communication, the handmaids are prevented from engaging intellectually with other women. Secondly, the handmaids are restricted from any kind of reading. They aren't allowed to read novels and newspapers, of course, but it goes beyond that. Like I mentioned before, the names of shops and everyday nouns, things that could not possibly be useful or morally inspiring to the handmaids, have been totally blanked from their world, which illustrates how the handmaids are not worthy of even those menial words and those small talk conversations. For example, in one of the earliest scenes in the novel, Offred prepares to do this shopping, one of the only tasks she's allowed to do outside of the home. Her shopping list is like this handful of tokens with pictures of the object she's supposed to get, and as she walks into town, she meets her shopping partner, who she's only permitted to greet with those pre-prescribed, vaguely euphemistic religious-based phrases like, "Blessed be the fruit," and "May the Lord open." When they get into town, even the names of the shops have been blanked out and replaced with pictures. With this, the handmaids are denied any kind of authentic communication or autonomy in the form of reading. They are mentally starved for communication, verbal or written, which means that something as small as magazine or text on a sign can become a major bargaining chip. This is exactly what happens later on in the book. The man who owns Offred, or runs the household that she is employed by, orders Offred to his office late at night, where she expects something sexual. Something like unspeakable, down on all fours perhaps, with whips and mutilations. Thus, she experiences a letdown of sorts when he asks her to play Scrabble with him. However, the effect that the words in the adult conversations have on Offred is clear later in the novel. Talking about a magazine that the commander dangled in front of her, Offred notes that she wanted it with a force that made the ends of her fingertips ache, and that reading it made her feel naughty. In their society, it's extremely dangerous, almost to the point of intoxicatingly, sensually so, for a man to invite women not just to read, but to be involved in the creation of words. So when the commander dangles these words over her, she is both under his control, which exploits her infantilization for his own pleasure, and delighting in the process of feeling adult for the first time in who knows how many years. The power he exerts over her is the ability to allow her to be an adult again, even if just for a brief period of time in his office. Lastly, and I'll talk a little bit more about her later, but one of the driving forces of infantilization in The Handmaid's Tale is the character of Aunt Lydia, a woman who indoctrinates the handmaids. She speaks to them as if they were children and is constantly referring to them as girls. She speaks condescendingly, asking constant rhetorical questions of the handmaids, like, "But they were godless, and that can make all the difference, don't you agree?" This kind of rhetorical questioning and chiding tone positions the handmaids not only as her inferiors, but as her pupils. Research shows that rhetorical questions are often utilized by school teachers because they help students understand low-level text better. Their leading nature draws students to the correct conclusion without requiring deep critical thinking about the topic at hand, according to an article written by Rotas. All of these different limitations on the handmaids and the effect of them on them is clear. By treating them as children, the handmaids are controlled both outwardly by society and inwardly as the way they think about themselves and their status as adults shifts. Secondly, to move on to Girl Defined, their photo-based posts and the accompanying captions also work to redefine and simplify linguistic communication. When I started my research, the very first thing I did was take all of the captions out of all the posts and put them through this Readability Formulas website, which is a reading comprehension site. After I did that, the word choice and sentence structure registered at, on average, about a 4th grade reading level. This is really problematic because they call their work engaging, challenging, and applicable for their target audience, which they identify as ages 13 and older. The implications of the target audience on the target audience is interesting. That womanhood and girlhood are exchangeable, that girls are ready for the trials of womanhood, like marriage and children, and that women are forever tied to a perpetual girlhood until they are married and moved on. With this blending, traditional hallmarks of adulthood, like puberty or moving away from one's parents, are rendered irrelevant. For Girl Defined and like-minded ministries, the true passage into womanhood is marked by marriage and childbearing. As such, the age of adulthood isn't tied directly to a milestone like turning 18. It's something that can be freely performed at any age, following a proper working period. To talk a little bit more about the captions, the textual patterns that emerged during my data collection include the frequent use of uppercase words to denote emphasis, the repetition of certain words or phrases, and explanations for everyday words, like sovereign is a fancy word for saying he is Lord over all. They also use a lot of rhetorical questions, which I talked about a little bit earlier. So one example, sister, do you believe this truth? Do you believe the one who designed you gets to define you? I'll do a deeper walk into these codes identified on the next slide, but these are the main kind of things that popped up for me, text-wise. So I thought you guys might enjoy seeing a little bit of how I did this project. First on the right, you can see, or on the left, I'm sorry, you can see the image that Girl Defined posted on the 27th of May and the accompanying caption. When I started reading through the posts I collected, I would basically have Google Doc open and be typing down everything I was thinking while I was reading, and then annotating the image alongside it. After I did that so many times, I could see the kind of things that were popping up for me on a regular basis and develop larger generalizations based on those. So in this image, the first thing I noticed was how often they used the word light. I counted it up and they used it 9 times in just 11 short sentences, so that's pretty high. Secondly, I was puzzled by the use of the phrase word pictures to explain a fairly commonplace word, metaphors. That was a little bit bizarre, and I noticed they did that a lot, so it became a code of mine. The pink things down here represented patterns of speech that I felt were condescending, but more in a general way. This didn't really become an established code of mine, but it was something that I paid attention to because it made me, as the audience, feel like they didn't trust me and my intelligence to understand what they were talking about. So like in here, in the second sentence of paragraph 2, they say, but then in Matthew 5, he turns the table on us, his followers, and calls us to let our light shine. I feel like it's fairly obvious who the us is in that second paragraph, but the double clarification with the parentheses and the all capitalized us makes me feel like they didn't think I was intelligent enough to get that. The orange codes were for emojis, which I'll talk a little bit about more later, and the pink stands for the sisterhood community that they're building in this account. Bethany and Kristen position themselves as the authority of this community, as the ones acting as a conduit for other young women's relationships to Christ. Lastly, the green code at the bottom represents any time they plugged their personal resources, so paid things like books or devotionals and clothing items from their shop. I also paid attention to the pastels on the image that accompanied this post. Pastels are pretty often used to signal girlhood explicitly, and this aesthetic feeds directly into that signaling. As for The Handmaid's Tale, my evidence, this was spanned across a whole book, which was like 250 pages, so obviously it's not going to be quite as condensed and intense as the Girl Defined codes were, but my approach was similar. I'd read through the novel, write down quotes that caught my eye, and kind of annotate the page alongside it. So this is the page I was referring to earlier, where author meets her shopping partner, or her spy, and they exchange this call to communication. The acknowledgement of these greetings and responses as accepted was really interesting to me, and proved how deeply these women were being controlled. A lot of this evidence is stuff that really builds on itself later on in the novel, so the single page of it doesn't do it justice or paint the whole picture, but you can see what's going on. Okay, my mini point for this section is logicide, which I talked about earlier. It's the occurrences in both texts. I noticed there were a lot of instances where both texts were reframing complex but critical ideas that revealed a subtle switching of meaning in a way that complicated the use of those words. So as Hedges puts it, the words are deconstructed and assigned diametrically opposed meanings. In The Handmaid's Tale, Aunt Lydia relies on logicide to break down the values that the handmaids hold and reconstruct them to fit into the new world of Gilead. For example, she says that the handmaids are lucky to be living in a time where they are safe, and reassures them that they still have freedom, just not the kind they're used to. She says, there is more than one kind of freedom, freedom to and freedom from. In the days of anarchy, so when America was existing, it was freedom to. Now you are being given freedom from. Don't underrate it. Though Aunt Lydia is signaling important concepts of American values to the handmaids, readers are aware that this is ridiculous. The handmaids aren't free in any way, shape, or form. As demonstrated in the study, they are controlled and infantilized in every facet of their life. The only reason they don't have to be worried about being attacked by a random man on the street is because they are regularly assaulted inside the homes that they're trapped inside. Yet, Aunt Lydia takes this as a chance to tell the handmaids how much freedom they have and implies that they're being empowered by this process. In Girl Defined, there are similar instances of reframing language. The most obvious comes from a post on June 14th, where the women are discussing stereotypes that Christian women cannot be strong. They say this is false and go on to urge their followers that they should be strong, but immediately couch that statement by saying that you have to be the right kind of strong. What's the right kind of strong, you ask? Well, it turns out you have to be strong enough to fight for the things that Girl Defined says matters, and back that by saying that it's God's word, or God's truth. Their assertion of the list of things that God is passionate about is first a few buzzwords that don't really mean anything in this context, but are generally considered good. Truth and life. And then they add in things that matter to their specific movement. Marriage, between a husband and a wife. Purity, by dressing modestly and remaining abstinent until marriage. And the importance of traditionally delineated gender roles. With this and the framing of these values as God's truth, they've taken a buzzword, strong, used by organizations aiming to empower women, and twisted it to forward their own personal beliefs. Their notion of strength requires the audience to be passionate about the exact same things Girl Defined messaging relies on, thus fulfilling Hedges' claim about language corrupted in this way. When used by the powers that be, the term liberty means the liberty that comes with accepting a very narrowly conceived Christ and the binary worldview that acceptance promotes. So, my next major point, the next thing I noticed in both texts was the way that women were controlled with infantilizing clothing, environments, and by the way that others around them acted with their bodies. These visual symbols subconsciously and consciously influence these women to adopt these infantile mindsets. In The Handmaid's Tale, the visual clues are most obviously seen in the environments that they live in and the clothing that they're forced to wear. Foucault notes that the process of designating the symbolic inhabitant, so the person who's the subject of the panopticon, needs to be denoted with certain visual cues because it makes them easier to monitor, it others them in society, and it helps break them mentally. First, the environment that the handmaids are in frames them as children. I think I mentioned this earlier, but they're indoctrinated in a building that was once an old grade school, and this is so important to the story that a description of this is what opens the entire novel. This cannot be misinterpreted. They were placed in this school and given childish beds with flannelette sheets like those of children to reduce them to the role of children, being retrained to be pliable and infantile. The effect of this is quite simple. Directly after a description of her bedroom, Offred notes, I try not to think too much. Like other things now, thought must be rationed. There's a lot that doesn't bear thinking about. Thinking can hurt your chances. She's been cued by the environment, along with other things, to reduce her thinking. Secondly, the uniforms worn by the handmaids infantilize them, both in the way that they have no choice in what they're wearing, and also in the way that any hint of bodily womanhood is disguised. They're given the ambiguous shapes of children with a uniform that includes flat-heeled shoes, full sleeves and a skirt, and a flat yoke that covers their chest, along with white wings that surround their face and cover their hair. The mental effect of this modest clothing is clear. When a group of tourists visit Gilead, and there's some women in there, Offred stares at them, shocked, and thinks it has taken so little time to change your mind about things like this, thus illustrating how deeply the roots of infantilizing indoctrination reach in her mind. Similar to the Handmaid's Tale uniforms, the women of Girl Defined encourage their followers to dress modestly at all times. It goes beyond that, however, Kristen and Bethany also signal infancy to their audience in a variety of ways, and clothing is only one of them. So to reiterate, Girl Defined does far better on visual platforms than text-based alone. Their lowest platform engagement is Twitter, which is obviously a word-based platform, where their official account has less than 4,000 followers. On visual-based platforms like Instagram and YouTube, their official account has 70,000 followers and 170,000 followers respectively. So a big jump there. As such, it is evident that their curated visual aesthetic is a key component of their widespread success on visual platforms. This is supported by scholars Mickelson and Cornfield, who assert that Clark and Beale advise girls and women to embrace divinely ordained gender roles and to consider white feminine beauty as their highest fulfillment and reflection of God's glory. As such, the visual aspect of their platforms is critical to their success. And part of that aesthetic is the submissive positions that they put themselves in when modeling for photos. Often they pose as children do, with their mouths wide open and in positions like piggybacks, dances, popping across the screen. These poses, where their bodies are slanted and askew, ultimately create the effect of childishness, of unpreparedness, and they are formally termed canting positions by communication scholar Aaron Goffman. Further, these poses themselves are infused with ideas of submissiveness and sexuality. Goffman writes in the script for a documentary produced by the Media Education Foundation that all of these head and body canting configurations leave women in a position where they seem utterly defenseless and, in this way, can be read both as an expression of acceptance, of subordination, of submissiveness, and appeasement. So specifically what I'm looking at here, this piggybacking thing, you can see this girl in this diagram is wearing a pink shirt and pink pants. Here in the middle, Bethany here on the left is cocking her head, and both of them are holding the book with their very, very tippy fingertips, which is a big part of canting. And you'll notice that in marketing, if you guys look at advertisements that women are in, they're always like holding things like this, whereas men are like grasping things. Anyways, you can see it over here. Bethany is again wearing purple sweatshirt, which hides all her curves, and pink pants. Kristen is wearing a bright yellow sweatshirt that is very loose fitting. They're laughing, they're having a great time. They look like they're in a yogurt commercial. All is well. So yeah, I talked about the clothing a little bit, but they also argue that women have a responsibility to not act as stumbling blocks to their brothers in Christ by exposing them to feminine body parts or poses that may be arousing. So that's kind of what's going on there too. Furthermore, in the captions and graphics of their posts, sparkles and flowers are common occurrences. While these things are not offensive in their own right, when used in conjunction with the soft pinks and yellows, it's infantilizing and also jarring in the context of their deeper subject matter. So in one post from May 13th, they established that if women experiment sexually before marriage, or deviate from heterosexuality, they will eventually reject God as creator. The message is really quite serious, and yet the post is adorned with swirly text and heart emojis. Ultimately, all of the visual effects and the underlying message serves to insinuate to the viewer that they, as women, are closely aligned with children and that they should act as such. My next major point is the communities of infantilization and control. And as a disclaimer, I want to note that there are some big, very serious differences between the communities of violence in Gilead and The Handmaid's Tale and the women of Girl Defined. I do not aim to create a false equivalency here and make it sound like Bethany and Kristen are out flailing women with jumper cables or anything like that. But the fact remains that a huge part of their success revolves around their hateful rhetoric being disguised as quiet and pretty, and it does impact their audience. Social cognitive theory argues that social norms, i.e. what is deemed acceptable and unacceptable, are learned by observing behavior of role models such as these on social media, and to an extent that this learning can result in the internalization of learned norms or ideals, according to a study done by Robert Lehan. This is particularly true of adolescents who are still trying to form a stable self-identity. In that same study, researchers found that Instagram and Facebook usage among teenage girls was linked to a state of poor mental well-being related to the internalization of sexual ideals. As such, a platform like Girl Defined, which is used to spread the message that behaving in an acceptable way sexually, thus in an explicitly heterosexual and abstinent way, is linked to their self-worth and a relationship with God. And that has tangible effects on young women's self-esteem and well-being. So what they're saying truly does impact their audience in what I would argue is a negative way, even though it's not outright violence. In The Handmaid's Tale, the community of control that I refer to is the system of surveillance that keeps the handmaids constantly worrying. They're too worried to connect with others that They might be a spy. They were too worried to even think a deviant thought because, as Aunt Lydia says, Gilead knows no bounds. Gilead is within me. The women embody the sense of surveillance so deeply that they mentally regulate themselves. They assume they are under the threat of violence at all times. On page 20, author talks about passing through the Guardian checkpoint in the way to town, and she says, I don't see the floodlights in the pillboxes because of the wings around my face. I just know they are there. Her faith in the system reveals the major effect of the panopticon, that the totality of the system has rendered the actual need for surveillance unnecessary. She will assume she is watched at all times, threatened at all times, and thus behave without the need for threatening and watching. In light of this, any authentic personality will be diminished and replaced by an infantile, autonomously regulating baby-making machine. Though Offred retains some mental autonomy, her behavior suggests that she is well on the way to becoming one of Gilead's ideal citizens. As for Girl Defined, their community looks very different, but still holds a great amount of influence over their audience. Bethany and Kristen write on their website that their goal is to build an online sisterhood where girls and women can find the encouragement and answers that they're looking for. This is backed up in various posts of theirs. They often refer to their followers as various kinds of sisters, so dear single sister, or the sister who is struggling, and often intersperse their captions with a conversational sister to introduce a new idea. The ultimate idea of the sisterhood community is meant to offer wise counsel to each other when in need of guidance. The act of getting counsel is often reinforced or referenced in Girl Defined posts in a way of sustaining loyalty and commitment to the group. As an aside, the familial womanhood bond is emphasized also in Handmaid's Tale as well. You may have noticed those in charge of disciplining and indoctrinating the handmaids are called aunts. And Aunt Lydia emphasizes this when she says, what we're aiming for is a spirit of camaraderie among women. We must all pull together. So there's that same vein of like sisterhood. We're all in this together. The construction of women with more power, shaming tactics, and the capabilities to inflict extreme violence upon the handmaids as blood-related, mentorly family members is a deliberate tactic employed to create loyalty and guilt among the indoctrinees. So, as blood-related sisters and the matriarchs of the Girl Defined organization, Kristen and Bethany position themselves at the top of the sisterhood hierarchy as the end-all be-all authority on God. Captions like, we know this is a lot to think about. You don't have to figure everything out right now, that are immediately followed by a plug for their content. Learn more in our book, Sex, Purity, and Belongings of Christian Girl, frame them as women that have it all figured out. This is an example of social criticism's informational superiority in which Bethany and Kristen attempt to position themselves as the ideal, perfect women for their demographic and frame their success as attainable to their followers through the endorsement of their content, podcasts, blogs, whatever. They also use their previous common obstacles to fulfilling evangelical and fundamentalist expectations. So Bethany got married pretty late for her religion at the age of 30, and the other sister, Kristen, had several miscarriages as credibility for giving lifestyle advice to the next generation of fundamentalist girls, and as rationale that there is no excuse to not serve God faithfully because they went through the worst and here they are serving. So that's the communities of infantilization and control. Lastly, the biggest similarity and the most obvious one between these areas of studies is the implicated or forced control of sexual behavior of women. Both those in charge in Gilead and the women of Girl Defined work to ensure that any kind of sexual encounter happens with the correct person at the correct time of life and for the correct purpose, to create soldiers in training for the kingdom of God. And that's a quote from Girl Defined. This complete removal of choice in the matter treats women as incapable of making their own choices and decisions about what is best for them in favor of the simplistic goal of procreation. In The Handmaid's Tale, this is very obvious. Love and sexuality virtually do not exist. Women are divvied out to men as rewards for good behavior, and the only opportunity for sexual contact is the ceremony, where the handmaids are literally encircled by the wives and the husbands and raped by the commanders in hopes of creating a healthy child. Sexual relations are for the strict purpose of producing pregnancy. There is no pleasure or choice in the matter, especially for the handmaids. As a little aside here, Offred says in the novel that she had a choice and that this is what she chose. However, I disagree with that. Her only other choice is being sent to clean up radioactive waste without protective equipment, which is no real choice at all. And as Candy Abby notes in her article, Bargaining with Patriarchy, Offred has become a participant with a vested interest, an unwilling participant, but a participant in a system that she is oppressed by. She has no way to operate outside the system, and so she must bargain with the power that she still has, her reproductive capabilities, by fulfilling this role. Also in The Handmaid's Tale, any past sexual transgressions are used as fuel to shame the handmaids. In a process called testifying, one handmaid shares the transgression and is then shamed by the rest of the group. For example, one handmaid Janine tells of being gang raped and being abortioned at the age of 14, as the women around her chant that it was all her fault, that she led the men on, and that she deserved it. This deep repression of sexuality and the accompanying shame results in wildly deviant behavior. For example, the commander, though he is a man of power, regularly frequents a gentleman's club called Jezebel's, where women are forced into prostitution, serving the very men who created the system restricting sexuality in the first place. So the entire system is really for the purpose of exerting demeaning, infantilizing control over women, not any real moral or religious reason, though it is framed and justified in that way. Secondly, the women of Girl Defined echo similar sentiments on the importance of childbearing, and much of their content deals with the importance of staying pure for one's husband. As mentioned above, any kind of extramarital sexual or LGBTQ plus relationship is an example of sexual chaos, which is always followed by the rejection of God. This fear-based messaging works to tell audience that any kind of deviation from the perfect script of acceptable sexual behavior is met with the loss of God, which is the very foundation that these poor young women's lives are built upon. So that's very scary. That's frightening. The importance of childbearing can be seen in this post from June 30th, where they assert that society's views on children, that women should have children if and when they're ready, is wrong in the eyes of God. They say that God made family and mothers for a reason, and so women must obey by having a lot of children as soon as possible. This post is accompanied by a graphic of a sweetly smiling young girl with her hair neatly done in buns. She reflects some of the nicer aspects of motherhood, spending time with an obedient child, a quiet and well-kept one. From what I've heard, this is not how motherhood is. This argument that children are women's purpose as ordained by God, when posted with a graphic that romanticizes childbearing to this degree, is problematic, especially in a culture like fundamentalism, where women are encouraged to marry and produce children as young as possible. This is done in part to allow young women to have as many children as possible. I think I talked about this in the caption a little bit already, but children should be viewed as a precious investment, and for children, a soldier in training for the kingdom of God, which fits into the evangelical notion that they're in the midst of a culture war battling those who do not agree with their values. Ultimately, both texts encourage or enforce fruitful multiplying and remove most, if any, choice that women have in the matter. This infantilizes them, rendering them unable to have any say over their body or what it is used for. Additionally, the way that Girl Defined romanticizes children and mothering as easy when it really is very difficult, hard work, is worrisome when pressed on impressionable young women who may not be ready for motherhood. So those are all my main points. I wanted to briefly talk, I know I'm running out of time, but briefly talk about, I think this research had some serious constraints, with time being the largest one. I feel like I would have benefited from analyzing several different groups, or at least from several different media from Girl Defined. So their video blogs, which have more information like patterns of natural speech and provide more fluid body language in the photos, would be a really rich source of data. As for future research, I think there's a lot to be said about the intersection of Christianity and capitalism. Christianity's intersection with capitalism is nothing new. Sarah Mosler notes that there is extensive historical collaborations between evangelicals and consumer culture. And in the chapter Christian Retailing, scholar Colleen McDaniel illustrates this idea by looking at Christian consumerism in the late 1920s in America. For Girl Defined specifically, I find the label of ministries to be inaccurate for what I see as the Girl Defined company. This distinction is important to me because though they're categorized as a tax-exempt nonprofit, they do a good deal of work on their Instagram to promote their storefront and encourage the purchase of various items unrelated to faith. Hair accessories, sweatshirts, earrings, and mugs. Additionally, Girl Defined founder Bethany has recently created an Instagram account dedicated to helping stay-at-home moms earn extra income for their families by encouraging them to become content creators. I believe an interesting avenue of scholarship would be to conduct a thematic analysis on the narratives present in Girl Defined Ministries and its various sister companies that allow for the union of Christianity and spending. For example, how the women of Girl Defined pivoted to rationalize a move to become financial contributors in their families when previously their major influence has been on women's work being regulated to the home sphere, specifically childbearing and raising. By putting the rhetoric of The Handmaid's Tale and Girl Defined Ministries in conversation with one another, I've drawn awareness to the seemingly similar rhetorical architectures used to indoctrinate and control women, one which aims to infantilize them on linguistic, visual, sexual, and community-based levels. I've also attempted to preview the ways in which these seemingly innocent accounts are beginning to affect the political and social landscape of America and change women's lives for the worse. To wrap things up, I want to re-emphasize the real-world effects of these quietly hateful messaging, like what Girl Defined does and the politics they're pushing for. This is not a theoretical concern. This is not women wanting to be scared, as one scholar asserted about women's reactions to Handmaid's Tale. Real women and real girls are having their lives destroyed by these bills that are passing recently. For example, a 10-year-old girl in Ohio was denied an abortion by her home state after being raped and impregnated by a 27-year-old man. A mother and daughter in Nebraska were charged with 2 felonies and 2 misdemeanors after the mother obtained abortion pills for her daughter, and the two spoke about it over a supposedly encrypted Facebook Messenger chat. A woman in Oklahoma was convicted of manslaughter after having a miscarriage. These examples and many more cases like them will become prevalent as there's a likely a rise in the restriction of women's ability to live independent, autonomous lives. So legislation like Senate Bill 8 in Texas, which bans abortions after the detection of cardiac activity in embryos around the 6th week of pregnancy before many women know they're pregnant. Even outside of a political realm, rhetoric like Girl Defines that pushes women out of educational programs and careers and into their husbands' arms as stay-at-home wives and mothers leaves them highly vulnerable to domestic abuse because they have no formal training to fall back on as a backup plan if the marriage goes south. For example, a report by the University of Wisconsin-Madison says that 99% of abused women suffered financial abuse, meaning that their husband controls all of the household money, making it nearly impossible to leave him. The position these women are in is nothing short of terrifying, especially if their extended family doesn't have the resources to accept her back into their home, or if they refuse to because divorce is a sin. So, with the establishment of the multi-pronged attack on women's autonomy and status as capable adults, both in Girl Defined Ministries and in The Handmaid's Tale, the full effect on target women and those around them can be, in the case of Girl Defined, inferred, and in The Handmaid's Tale, more clearly identified. This nurtured state of complacency in one situation is reinforced by the constant messaging that everything is all right, that your situation is honorable and enviable. This messaging sounds like encouragement towards gratitude, so have a heart of thanksgiving, and where I am is not a prison but a privilege. It sounds like words twisted with legicide to make one settle for less. There is more than one kind of freedom, and we must be the right kind of strong. And it sounds like the encouragement to keep your mind off your lack of fulfillment and life satisfaction. Only think about things that are true, honorable, just, pure, lovely, commendable, excellent, and worthy of praise. This simplistic positivity robs women of their rightful emotions of anger, injustice, and fear for the future, or if they are being unfulfilled, being stay-at-home mothers. It tells those same women that this is what they were built to do by God, and that they can have nothing else. It urges them to be submissive and thankful for all the rights they've been robbed of, and ultimately, it and the forces behind it don't care if they're unhappy. At the end of the day, as long as they're there, the system will survive, and that's all the patriarchy has ever meant. Thanks.
English and Communication Arts students, start us off.
I can start from this one. Second. If panopticism and theories about bargaining with the patriarchy suggest that this form of heteronormative self-suppression is in that person's control, and the fictional tale of Offred is her escaping from her role as a handmaiden, then in fitting with that, these femmes are placed in the position of power. They have control over their own reality. But if we look to modern reality with Girl Defined, it's quite contrary to that. What would you say are the implications of different theories or analysis that almost inadvertently are placing women in a position of power under a structure which they can't control?
That's a good question. Could you repeat the last part?
Yeah, just the implications of placing femmes in a position of power when really they're having their power taken away from them.
Right. I would say I think it's kind of a catch-22. I mean, like I spoke about briefly beforehand, Girl Defined expects the women going into their marriage to be completely pure and chaste, and recently I couldn't include this in my research project because it was just too late. It was outside the bounds of my research, but they've released a series on how to be a really fun and spicy wife in your marriage. So it's kind of like they're putting women in this paradox where they have to be absolutely pure and ashamed of any kind of sexual experience outside of marriage, even a self-inflicted one. And then as soon as they get married, they're supposed to flip the switch and be these totally feisty, fun, sexy ladies in the sheets. It's just, it's impossible to win, I guess I would say. I don't know what theories would be best fit for analyzing that, but it would definitely be interesting.
I could go next. So my question is, I was intrigued by the choice of The Handmaid's Tale as a primary source. With the popularity of The Handmaid's Tale with Hulu's TV show, something that I've noticed is a critique rising in BIPOC communities about The Handmaid's Tale and how it does not address and often speaks over the fact that this issue is not dystopian or new for women of color. I'm curious, how could your research and analysis connect to this critique?
Absolutely. There was one article that I read that spoke out against the use of handmaids as a symbol of, like, stick it to the man kind of thing, because that's exactly what they're ignoring. It's a very, like, white woman type of feminism. So I think that's definitely something that should be addressed, and honestly, I would have liked to talk about it a little bit more in this paper, but I was kind of at 70 pages already, and I was like, I should probably stop so that people will actually read this. I think I could have addressed it with a nod to that, like, this isn't a dystopia for a lot of women. Like, the article that I referenced where the scholar said that women just want to be scared, he's absolutely blatantly ignoring that this is a reality for women all over the world, and it has been for many, many years, especially women of color. And I think him saying that is just symbolic of the way those issues are ignored. I guess that doesn't really talk about how I could have integrated into my paper. Another thing I wanted to note was that the Women of Girl Defined, in accordance with that paper I was talking about white Christian nationalism, they have, I think, one woman that works for their company. They have like 10 or 12 women in the company altogether, and they have one woman of color, and they kind of put her in a lot of promotional materials, but only her, so it seemed almost tokenism to me. Yeah.
I'm curious if in your preliminary kind of scrolling of Instagram, if you found any accounts or organizations that are part of evangelical fundamentalist Christian movements like Girls Find, but that are catered to male audiences, and even if not, how you might think the rhetoric of such an account might be structured differently for a male audience. So like maybe the opposite of infantilization, or what you would think of.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I did not, and I scrolled a lot. I did not come across any of those kinds of accounts, and I don't know if that's because my algorithm is just really like knows I'm a woman or whatever, but I also don't think that there are that many resources out there for men that are like this for women. I have heard talks of, and this is just, I check in on like some of the other women in this context for the purpose of this research project, but I noticed that Bethany has started bringing her husband onto the podcasts more often, and there's been talk of him creating a guy-defined type of brother ministry. I don't know if that'll ever come to fruition. I would be really interested to see how it differs. I would definitely guess that it would run in a lot of the same veins of the reverse gender roles, so they would probably really encourage men to take leadership positions, to be strong for their wives, to provide, to be the headship of their relationship. I would assume there wouldn't be nearly as many sparkles and flowers, so.
Yeah, so although your project focused on women controlling this narrative in the Girl Defined, we see men controlling it more on the legislative side of things, whether that's, there's been recent legislation in Florida where girls can't discuss their period in the classroom until high school, or with the abortion question, that's largely controlled by men in these legislative positions. What have you found, or what do you think men can do to combat this narrative, and what role can men play in fighting this?
Good question. I would say, I don't know if listen is maybe the right thing to say, but like just kind of honor. One of the main things, I'm sure everyone's here has heard of mansplaining, and like the way that women are always talked over in classrooms, and their opinions are just kind of devalued. I would say, like, for somebody like you who I think is planning on going into politics, it would just be really valuable to be given the space to talk, and like if if you notice other people interrupting, just be like, she's not done. Like, there's things that men can do to fight this, even in a not very large scale way, I guess I would say. I don't have a battle plan, like, hey, everybody, let's go out there and like tear this down. So, yeah.
First of all, Allie, I want to say you did a really great job. I really enjoyed it. So you addressed at the end the concern that Girl Defined Ministries is making womanhood, is changing womanhood for the worst. But on the flip side, I was wondering, if they deem those who do not mimic traditional biblical womanhood as outsiders who need reform, do you think that broader society is transitioning towards a place where we might see Girl Defined as the social outliers?
I don't know if there's a time that we'll get to where the hegemonic truths are gonna be like totally flipped on their heads and it's gonna be like, these people are being totally persecuted. I will say, I think we're coming to a place as like a wider American society where people are finally getting more consequences for the things that they're saying that are very hateful, which I think is a good thing. I think if you're on Instagram and you're being really hateful, there should be consequences for that. I think those consequences will come naturally. I don't think it'll be the result of people persecuting them. I think also because they operate on such the internet allows people to comment things that they would never say in person. I think they and any other content creators get a lot of hate, and that allows them to kind of elevate that and show like, oh, look at all these hateful comments we got. So I think the difference for them is that they could always stop, whereas people that are minorities by birth and by nature just really can't. So that's the biggest difference I see there. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah.
I have a question. I'm venturing into dangerous territory
Okay.
about women's fashion. You pointed out in your paper, and you touched on it here, the clothing, it was loose fitting, and you made sure to point that out here. But then on the other side, you've seen, I see it at least on social media, women's fashion also moving in a looser direction because it's like we shouldn't be constrained to showing our curves off.
Yeah.
We shouldn't have to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So in your research or in your own personal experience, how do you navigate kind of the fusion of these two movements, which are moving towards the same thing, but for two totally different reasons?
Yeah. It's been really interesting. Like what I'm wearing right now, I have these wide pant legs. You can't see the curves on my legs at all. That kind of thing. So it's just weird watching it happen, like you said, for totally different reasons. I think the biggest difference that helps me rationalize it is when Girl Defined is doing that, they're doing it with the underlying notion that everyone should be dressing this way, and it's not a matter of choice. Whereas if I'm dressing this way, it's because that's what I feel most comfortable in, not because this is something that somebody's telling me to wear, and because I have to wear this or I won't get into heaven, that kind of thing. And conversely, one of the things that I really noticed that was really interesting is a lot of Girl Defined messaging when they're talking about clothing is oh, the outside world sexualizes everybody so much. Well, that's true, but it's also so does Girl Defined. Just they're also focusing on women's bodies, but just in a different way. They're focusing on the reproductive capability of their bodies, not necessarily the outside curves. I think I totally got lost in a maze of this question. Yeah, it's weird. The big difference is choice. Girl Defined is looking down on women that choose to reveal more of their bodies, whereas in the secular world, it's kind of either way is good.
I have a quick question for you. I know that we're bucking up against the time constraints. I'm wondering if you could speak to the research process of how you maintain scholarly curiosity in the midst of likely seeing and what you saw initially before you started the coding process and being overwhelmed by
Yeah.
what you saw. So were there things that you did to attempt to help yourself maintain that kind of, not necessarily balance, but to go in with an inquisitive eye rather than a
Rah.
yeah.
Yeah. I think helping to think about it as like a project and like all the constraints that go along with the project. So like I couldn't write in my paper, this is dumb because this. I had to be very like neutral about it and be like, well, why is that dumb? Oh, it's dumb because it treats women like children, and that's bad. It was hard.
Yeah.
I think there were definitely times where I just was like, I just need to take a break from this and feel like a whole human person and not just like a woman right now. As the girl defined is framing it. I don't really have any concrete answers. It just took a long time to get to that point.
Is it that question you can ask?
Yeah.
That's my pleasure. So first of all, this is beautifully written. I was like reading it, and I was like, oh my gosh, I hope I go to high school. Beautifully written. So something, my question's actually very much like related to, I would say like Lucy's and Becca's even too. So a lot of women of color scholars say, right, like Black women are deprived of childhood, even when they're children, right? And then even when you're talking about like Handmaid's Tale, right? Like I think Margaret Atwood straight up said like Black women were sent to the, right? All women of color were sent into labor positions, much like men. So I'm thinking, and what I think your project does really beautifully by centering two predominantly very like white women centered experiences. I'm curious to know why you think maybe infantilization is unique to white women. And I think because it is, and that's why I love your project so much, because it's fascinating, really. Yeah, I'm just curious to know what your thoughts are on that.
I guess, yeah, this paper definitely centered white women just because that's like the materials that I had. And that paper that I was talking about, the Girls Gone Fundamentalist, that one does a great job of talking about like specifically like the white things in these women that are being prioritized, which is very problematic and horrible. That paper is really well written. I've actually reached out to one of the scholars and like, yeah, anyways. I'm sorry, can you repeat the part?
Yeah, why is infantilization a unique trait placed upon white women, do you think?
I think because for a long time, white women have used it to their advantage. Like, I think it's happened to me before. I got pulled over by a cop one time, and I happened to be crying, not because he pulled me over, but for something else, and he totally didn't give me a ticket. And I'm like, would he given me a ticket if I was different identity-wise? Probably. I think it's sometimes easier for white women to lean into that, like, oh, I'm stupid, I don't know this is happening, than it is to be like, yeah, this is happening to a lot of other kinds of women too. It's not just me, you know, like, there's ways that white women can use their power to like tweak the scales in their favor, and infantilization is kind of second to that, I think.
Good project.
Great job, Allie. This is wonderful to see this all come to fruition. You spent a lot of time thinking about Offred in the Handmaid's Tale portion of your project, and it makes a lot of sense that you do, because she is one of the handmaids, and she's someone who is being infantilized in her clothing and her lack of ability to access words and reading. You also talk a little bit about Aunt Lydia, who's put in the position of, you know, putting her thumb on the younger women who are the handmaids. You don't talk a lot about Serena Joy. And I'm just wondering if you could think about Denise Candiati's theories about bargaining with patriarchy, and think a little bit about Serena Joy, who, for those of you who haven't read the novel, she is the wife of the commander, who of course holds Offred down during the sessions, monthly sessions. She has bargained with the patriarchy in a really unique way. In what way is her bargain worth it to her? What does she gain? What does she lose? Can you talk a little bit about that? And can you put that in all the Girl Defined? That's the follow-up question.
Okay, one thing at a time. So originally I really wanted to focus a lot more on Serena Joy, because she is one of those women that's working within the patriarchy to elevate herself over the rest of the women, to gain any kind of respect that she can. And she's doing that by indoctrinating the other women. She's like, oh, see, I'm like one of the good ones. I'm helping you out. But in the novel, she seems totally unhappy with her life. Her husband is like, aside from the ceremony and like the sexual things going on there. Her husband is emotionally cheating on her with each of the handmaids that comes through. So she makes a couple different comments in the novel about that and how she's unhappy with that, like how she and the other women fought for the right to keep their husbands or something. But also she just seems bored, like she's knitting and unknitting the same scarves over and over again. It seems like her own, she had this cause that she really worked to advance, and then once the cause was achieved, she had nothing left to fight for because she had fought against her own rights. So she seems really unhappy. She has some measure of respect. She's treated better than the rest of the handmaids, but it doesn't seem to give her any kind of self-satisfaction, really. As that relates to the Girl Defined girls, so Christine and I actually had this really interesting conversation about the way this small, tight-knit community of evangelical Christian fundamentalists works, and it's basically like they have all of these different tiers of, so Girl Defined is aimed at like the youngest upcoming women, and then there's different tiers that talk more about like middle-aged women and like the challenges of being a mother as a middle-aged woman, and then there's like the top tier, which is like the women that are putting out materials for like Asian women and like more into stage life type of things. And Christine was telling me that she sees this kind of great shift happening every so often where the women at the lower level kind of come up to this next level to influence this next level of women, So I guess I don't know how exactly Serena Joy would fit into that, other than she would probably be forgotten if Gilead had history books. I don't think her name will be given very much credit.
And what happens to the Girl Defined women when they're going through menopause?
It's so weird looking at them on these materials because they're aimed at women 13 to 30, and both of them are pushing 40 by now. They're rapidly aging out of the demographic that they're trying to influence.
Is their time up when their uterus doesn't work anymore?
Well, so they have a lot of sisters, and the sisters and some of the other younger women in their company are starting to be featured in the videos and in the reels more and more. And so I'm kind of thinking these are the women that are going to become the new face of Girl Defined as Bethany and Kristen start to focus more on their own families, but also on moving upwards.
So can you only bargain with the patriarchy when your uterus is functional?
Oh, no, absolutely not. You can definitely use your expertise to influence in different ways.
Yeah, okay.
So I'm looking at time.
Yeah,
So
sorry.
I was gonna ask you a Foucault question, but I can do that some other time.
Yes.
We can have that I was intrigued, I don't know if it's a question, but some of the graphic design stuff, did you take that straight from the Girl Defined?
Yeah,
site?
everything that you saw that I put up here, like,
So several of those things struck me as kind of 70s
yeah.
Jesus
Yeah.
movement
This-
retro.
Yeah.
Has anyone analyzed the sort of graphic design look
It's
of
just
their site?
what's current right now. Like, I think you'd see these kinds of things reflected in any really hyper trendy lifestyle influencer type page.
But that is also 1976 Jesus
Yeah.
with a guitar and long hair.
So-
I mean, that really is.
So yeah, my question is, are they knowingly trying to evoke that kind of countercultural evangelical
Oh, yeah.
Jesus
Yes,
Jesus
absolutely.
freak?
Like, you look at all the
movement.
beige, they have a lot of, this isn't quite equivalent to like the crunchy moms, but it's that same idea of like, F the man, like, I'm gonna stay home and raise the babies how I wanna raise them, and I'm gonna let them run around barefoot in the garden and eat stuff out of the vegetable garden. It's like, there's that element of like twisting it to the government, and this is like a very watered down version of that, but I would guess that that's a really astute observation.
So they are current the way.
Yeah.
They're showing the way.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
I think that's probably way over time, but thank you guys so much for coming. If you have any questions, feel free to talk to me afterwards.